This is your host, Larry Attention. With me today is Marissa Black. Care to tell the audience how we know each other, Marissa?
Hi. We work together at the same Catholic grade school. I think we met a year ago because I came in April last year. So it's been almost a year.
I remember that. Good weather. I'm always excited for the spring and the uh, rejuvenation of the earth. So you already sort of brought up the fact that we work at the same elementary schools. You're the second person from school that's been a guest at the for the podcast. But you care to just give us the details of what you do there?
Yeah. So I'm the middle school math teacher and English teacher for my homeroom. I was working at another school before, and then our grade school was missing a religion teacher. They didn't have one. She's on maternity leave. So I switched schools. So my other school placement wasn't really working out super well. So I switched schools to where we are now, partway through the year. And I feel like we just got to know each other through like recess monitoring, essentially. Just like in the
That
yard, making sure middle schoolers don't kill each other um, in the sunshine, which is great. I'm excited for that
exactly.
too. Um,
Yeah, that I remember that being fun.
yeah.
Just going outside. It wasn't part of my job description, but I like to be outside and take in my vitamin D, and just the sort of worshiping of Sol Invictus. I remember also just being a little nervous just because I know that I can talk a lot and can be a bit off-putting with just my conversation. So I'm glad that you mentioned that you enjoyed it, and that it was something that was a positive experience as opposed to what others experience,
Oh
which
my
is
God.
like, when is this guy gonna stop talking about the most random of things?
No, it was great because like where I had been before, there was no teacher culture at all. Of like teachers would not really talk to each other at all, or like really have any kind of bonding or like time or space for conversation. So it's just like, oh, I can sit outside with like a couple teachers and just like chat. And I don't know, it was just very like a cool, comforting culture to come into. So I feel like having spent time in a couple different school cultures is just like something really important to me. It's just teachers that can kind of just shoot the shit a little bit and like just hang out and talk in a yard. So it was cool to be able to do that.
Well, I'm glad that I was part of building that positive
Yeah.
culture. So yeah, that's amazing. Um, the next thing I wanted to sort of get into was just whether you have a family, or what your plans are in terms of in the future, and building that.
Yeah. So I'm not married, don't have a partner. So my family is just like my immediate family that I grew up with. I'm a middle kid. Got an older brother and a younger sister, my parents. So I don't know, I've never like envisioned myself as someone to ever like build a family necessarily or like have kids. That's never been like a desire of mine necessarily. Um, which I feel like just growing up as a young woman in our culture, it's kind of assumed that that is something that you want or something that you're like aiming for. And I feel like the last like maybe like 5 or so years, I kind of realized that about myself. Like, oh, I'm not necessarily like strongly opposed to creating or building a family. It's just never been something I felt like called to. You know, I feel like
Yeah.
if people have like start to build their own family, it should be something that you like have a deep desire for and feel called to. And I feel like it's just never something I've been called to. Um, and as a teacher, it's like I get my fill of having like 90 kids to be responsible for every day. So it's like, I don't know. I feel like I still get to, and I have nieces too. So I feel like I still kind of get to enjoy part of that role of like mentorship, not parenthood, because I think that's such a different role that I have so much respect for people who are parents because I don't know if it's one I could do. But I feel like still being able to be like a positive influence in a kid's life just from a slightly different angle of being an aunt or being a teacher, or as a camp counselor for a while too, just kind of like from the roles. I feel like still getting that like satisfaction and that joy from that and learning a lot too from students or my nieces. But yeah, I feel like it's never really been something I've really felt called to. But from like peripherally, I've still been able to kind of enjoy some similar parts of that role, even though I know parenthood itself is such, I can't even imagine, such a different experience.
Yeah. How old are you?
I'm 28.
Yeah. And the reason I ask is because your comment right now was, aside from the fact that, I'm a man and you're a woman, is basically 100% of what I would have said at your age too. And so it's interesting because I think not necessarily that this is something that you're going to go through as you get older and mature, but I do think that there comes a point where life can make it so that you feel a sort of need or drive to become a parent. Because I was in the same boat that you were. I had nieces and nephews, and I had been a teacher. I've been a teacher since I was 22, 23. So I was like, yeah, I don't necessarily want that extra responsibility in my life. I don't think that with my lifestyle, I would be a particularly good father or even, partner. Um, but there did come a point where there was a switch, and I mean, I don't know what to attribute it to other than, I don't know, maybe developmental, stage sort of idea of how life unfolds. But maybe that's something that, you know uh next time we have another conversation, you sort of like change your mind on, or just maybe remain the same too. Neither decision is obviously the right one, but it's just interesting
Right.
how um I was on the same boat and wavelength.
Yeah, like I definitely believe life, it unfolds itself in seasons. And I feel like it's one of those things where I'm like, okay, in this current season of being a grad student and a full-time teacher, and like having moved to Philly just a couple of years ago and like just kind of starting to like really develop and unfold my life here. It's like, okay, this is this current season. And like I don't see that for myself like building a family right now, like in this current season. But it's like one of those things where you're like, okay, like maybe a future season version of myself would be down for that. But it's just like, yeah, in previous seasons and the current season haven't felt that like drive necessarily. But yeah, I mean, future seasons, who knows?
Yeah. And you're definitely more open and mature in terms of how you're talking about it than I was, because I was completely like cynical, pessimistic about the prospects of, civilization, the world.
That's
I
valid
was,
though. I have those feelings sometimes.
oh yeah.
Where I'm like, is this really with our current climate? Do I want to bring a kid into this? I don't know, you know?
Exactly. So then maybe yeah, we were looking at it from that perspective, and we don't want to be too cynical and dark in this
Right.
particular conversation. But
Yeah.
yeah, I was definitely in a very anti-natalist sort of like neo-Malthusian sort of mind state, where you're like, is it intelligent and a altruistic choice to bring another life into the world? And my views on those sort of positions have radically changed, and that's like a conversation for another day and a whole nother podcast. But I do think that at that point in my life, I was definitely a lot more cognizant of how particular individual decisions could have a wide impact. And I was definitely, obviously, taking into consideration and weighing the wider impact of certain decisions more. But I do think that one shouldn't necessarily go into extremes or way too far into one of those points, because
Right.
it could definitely warp or distort how you live your life and
Yeah.
think about the future, yourself, and things that might make you happier, or allow for more meaning in your life to exist, or for fulfillment. You already sort of brought up a little bit about your family life and being a middle child, which I am too. So just tell
Okay.
me a little bit more about your experience growing up with your mom and your dad, and siblings.
Yeah, so I grew up in Everett, Washington, which is like 20 minutes north of Seattle. Um, and my my parents are still together. Grew up with my older brother he's almost 32 now. So he's like 4 or 5 years older than me. And then my little sister is 26. And my little sister has Down syndrome and autism, and she's nonverbal and has been her entire life, my entire life, obviously. Um, so that was always like kind of an interesting part of our family culture, is just like having a sibling who's a person with disabilities, and like especially having a nonverbal sibling was just interesting. Of like it My brother and I became closer, of just like it was easy for us to like play together and like grow up like having conversations and stuff. And it's like our family would always go to a lot of events for people with disabilities and like advocacy things and like marches, walks, things like that. Just with other families in around Seattle that had kids with special needs, disabilities. So that was always like, I don't know, an interesting part of our culture. And randomly, the church we grew up into it was a pretty small church, but it had a lot of families with kids with disabilities too. So it was like sort of part of our church culture too, which was interesting. Um, but yeah, we grew up in like just like the suburbs. But we had like all these woods behind our yards. So when I think of like growing up, like my childhood was just like we were always in the bog, in the swamp, in our woods, and like just I don't know, just like messing around. I was really good friends with like all the neighborhood kids. Like they'd always be over. We'd be at somebody's house all the time. My like childhood best friend is still my best friend. She grew up across the street from me. We were just always playing in the woods or coming up with some dumb game outside, like out on the street till the street lights come on, kind of a thing. And it was just really, I don't know, something I really didn't necessarily appreciate till I got older, of just recognizing how a lot of, especially our students and like Gen Z kids in general, aren't always growing up with that, whether for safety issues or just where they live or just access to outdoor spaces. I'm definitely very grateful for having had that. Um, just like a safe outdoor space to be able to play in right in my own backyard, and to be able to do that safely and have a fun time and still come home covered in mud, and mom being fine with that.
Yeah, and it's to include to the reasons you enumerated about children not being able to experience the outdoors and just nature the way that you did. Sometimes they do have the access, but I think the technological pull is so strong now too,
Yeah.
where they're just ignoring it and becoming sort of enmeshed and just inside of their phones and the reality of technology, as opposed to the reality of nature and the world.
Which, like,
But
I hate to be like, oh, Gen Z kids, like they're always on their phones. But like there is a component of it that I even see with like my own students, of just like, okay, when I ask them what are you doing on the weekend, it's like, oh, I'm going home and I'm gonna game. Or I'm gonna, be a lot of them like game, but they do game together. Like I hear about
yeah,
after the weekend of like 10 of them were all on the same Discord or whatever. And I'm like, okay, I'm glad they are still finding ways to have community with it, which I think is more positive use of
yes.
it instead of just like, by themselves, which I think there's a time and a place, but it's definitely overwhelmingly when I ask them like,
Mhm.
what did you do yesterday after school or what'd you do on the weekend? It's usually something tech related, for better or for worse. And I don't know, it's sort of like, I don't hear so much like, oh, I went and kicked a soccer ball around with my friends at the park or went on a walk, or I don't know. It's like, yeah, there's kind of that notable difference that I try not to be like, oh, stereotype. They're always on their phones. I'm like, kind of like
Yeah.
in some way, in some manner, it definitely does look a lot different than when I was their age.
Yeah, I agree completely with that. And while you were talking, I couldn't help but just think of your experience as like the ideal Pacific Northwest childhood, right? Like,
So true.
It's, it sounds like exactly what I would have expected.
Yeah, which I always like make fun of myself because like I hate hiking. You cannot drag me on a hike. I tried so long to be like, I'm gonna be that Pacific Northwest girl that loves to hike. I hate it. I literally took a hiking class in college to try to force myself to like hate hiking, and I absolutely hated it. And it's just that, and like I don't know, just all the Pacific Northwest activities. I'm like, no, that's the worst. Don't make me camp outside in the rain. That sounds terrible. But there was that aspect of like, I don't know, just being able to mess around outside and
Yeah.
be in
But
the
yeah,
woods.
exactly.
We
It's like
appreciate that.
the way you made it sound was like it was an organic
Yeah.
relationship that you had with the outdoors and just playing outside and building relationship and community with the children around you, as opposed to what hiking and camping is, which is like,
Right.
ironically, it's all about like planning and like, okay, how do I use it as an escape of, you know, modern technological society? But, you're obviously like instrumentalizing nature as something that you use to escape, as opposed to just, oh, we're just inhabiting and within the reality of nature, and not necessarily thinking of it instrumentally.
I didn't think of that juxtaposition of it being organic versus planned. Funny how nature can be planned.
Exactly. Yes.
I feel like it definitely contributed to me, like I said earlier, seeing the world as like seasons or like life as in seasons of just being in the woods and knowing exactly which berries are going to be like ripening when. And like, I don't know. I always thought I don't have any tattoos, but I always thought like if I ever had any, it would be some kind of like something from the woods that I grew up in. Like I know school's gonna end soon when I see like the cherry trees blossoming in the yard because that's like June, May, June in Seattle for our trees at least. And then I know summer's just started with the salmon berries, and I know it's like the middle of summer when the huckleberries are out. I know school's about to start and the blackberries are out. It was like you could always just tell the seasons of like life just by like what was growing in
That's
the woods. I feel like it kind of directed a lot of my like understanding of the cyclical nature of things as a kid.
it's great to see someone be able to just measure the seasons in a way that isn't predicated on, calendars like I do. Like I have, I'm like, oh, winter's coming. I know the leaves are going to fall, and that's all I know. And then you're like, oh, spring, the sun is out, yay! But you have a much better understanding and a holistic view. So I really appreciate
Like
people
I
like
know
you. Yeah.
seasonal affective disorder will lift once I start seeing daffodils because I know that means it's spring and like the sun is going to be returning. Just trying to look to that for like cues.
Yeah. Aside from your neighborhood and just being in the Seattle area, how would you describe your experience in the educational system?
Well, I grew up, so my family was very conservative Protestant Christian. This one sect called Calvinism that I grew up in that I deconstructed a lot in the last like 10 years. But because of that, the people that I went to, a tiny little church that I went to, people from there started the school that I went to. So it was the same theological bubble of my family, my church, and my school. Like I saw all these kids like literally 7 days a week, and which was exhausting sometimes. But it was my school was a pre-K through 12 school, so all grades are in the same spot. We are divided into grammar school and secondary school, but we were all still in the same building. It just kind of divided like honestly uniform colors and like rotating your schedule versus sitting in the same being in a self-contained classroom.
Yeah.
But it was a private Christian school, and I was there third grade through 12th grade, so I was homeschooled till third grade.
Okay.
um, and then was at the private school third through 12th. But it was a classical school, so it was really academically rigorous, way harder than college or grad school, honestly. Just like
Wow.
academically, it was really intense. And like I had to take Latin for 10 years and was like, we would just study like Greek and Roman history, philosophy, theology, like all that stuff. So I do really appreciate some aspects of it of just like discipline and responsibility. Um, Not procrastinating, even though I still do that. Um,
Hmm.
like respect for others and teachers, and I don't know, a lot of those, and being able to like really think through things and not just agree with things because people around you are agreeing with them. Although ironically, that's kind of just how like I still felt in that bubble, just like I kind of just believed everything because everyone else believed it. But they were very big on like critique, like self-critique and critiquing others' works. And they functioned on a model of what was it, grammar, and then logic and rhetoric stage. So the grammar stage of just like rote memorization when you're little, memorizing facts, figures, just kind of basic things that you can just like be able to rattle off. And then middle school was like the logic phase. So 8th grade, we didn't even take math. 8th grade, we took logic as a class, and just like, okay, how do you rationalize things? You reason through things, which I like kind of want to bring back a little bit for some of my middle school classes. I'm like, I need a logic class sometimes. I'm not understanding that if A equals B and B equals C, that A equals C. Stuff like that, where I'm like, we might need some of this. And then high school was the like rhetoric phase. So having, and we had an actual rhetoric class of like speeches, speech writing, speech, like actually giving speeches. We had to do a senior thesis senior year of like writing a 20-page paper, memorizing it, and then defending it like you would a PhD. And I still, when I can tell when I'm stressed, because I get stress dreams that I have to do my high school again. Like it was so much.
Right. Well,
I don't know. It was a lot, but I am grateful for the things like being able to kind of like think through things and use those like stages and but aspects of my brain.
yeah.
I don't know. Tiny classes though. I was the only girl in my senior graduating class. There were 6 people, like tiny little school. My brother is the only guy out of 4 people, like small little school.
Yeah. That's very interesting. I mean, maybe during our uh daily chats last year, I should have shut up more and picked your brain a lot more. Because I would have known these things.
Eh,
Mentioning that you were homeschooled, how would you compare the experience learning at home versus how you learned in school? And yeah, and can you break that down, or were you just a little bit too young to have a sense of um, how the differences impacted you and which
right.
one you preferred?
To be honest, I don't remember a lot of it because it was till I was like 7 or 8. I just remember the last year I was homeschooled. I was homeschooled. My sister was in a special ed class at a local public school, and my brother was in the private school. So all 3 of us were in totally different schooling systems. And my mom was like, "All right, I guess I'm just like a taxi driver now, just like driving, pick up this kid, drop off that kid, take this one to soccer." And I'm just in the car. My mom's like, "All right, we're sticking on some phonics, like cassette tapes in the van, and you're just going to listen to phonics as we go pick up your brother." Like, I just remember that last year being like chaotic.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember. I mean, my mom's been like a piano teacher for decades, and her grandma was a piano teacher, and her mom was like a long line of piano teachers, which I'm the weak link. But like she like knew how to convey like information and like be able to teach things, which I do appreciate because I know not everybody who's homeschooled like has a parent that's necessarily gifted at that. So she was good with that. And I do remember a few things of like studying ancient Egypt. I was one of those kids that just loved like the ancient Egypt, the archaeology and all aspects of that. I thought was so cool. I remember her like she had this canteen and she put some stuffed animals in it and like dug it and buried it into our garden in the backyard and had me do like an ancient Egypt archaeological dig kind of a thing. It was really fun. Just stuff like
Yeah.
that she could do with, one kid at home, which you wouldn't necessarily get to do in like a classroom. And we went to like a co-op too, from what I remember. It was like once a week. So once a week we would go to like a school for tons of kids that were being homeschooled and would have like a consistent class every week, basically. But I remember it being like music, and there was one that was like character. So we learned about a different character trait every week, like diligence one week and honesty another week and stuff like that. But yeah, that's kind of, it's like way in the back of my brain. I remember.
The recesses of my unconscious.
Generally being positive. I don't remember anything like necessarily bad about it, but I am glad that I got to switch into like
Okay.
schooling system. Like I am grateful for that. I don't think I would have liked being homeschooled the whole time. But when I was little, it worked for when I was little.
Yeah, why is that?
Why, like, I felt like it worked, or why, like, I'm glad I switched?
You glad you switched?
Um, I think it was good for me to, like, be in a classroom and hearing, like, different opinions and perspectives on things. Um, and while, again, generally everyone was kind of the same bubble background, there
Mhm.
was still some amount of, like, diversity in opinions and, like, backgrounds that I could kind of I feel like that got to develop, like, some empathy that I might not necessarily have had just from, like, ignorance of just
Mhm, mhm.
being only, myself in a class.
Yeah.
Um, I'm grateful for that, and, like, I got to do some sports and theater and student government stuff that, like, I wouldn't have gotten to do, so.
It was a bubble, but the bubble you were in at home was so much smaller.
Smaller concentric circles of bubbles.
Yeah. Um, it's I love this conversation because I went to California last month, and
Oh,
two
nice.
friends and I were having a discussion, debate, dialogue about the pros and cons of homeschooling. And I was on the pro camp, and ideally I think I would love to homeschool my daughter Marilyn,
Yeah,
um, but the sort of strictures and the financial responsibilities that Paula and I have make it so that we both have to work,
yeah.
and so it would be really really hard unless like I'm able to win the lottery, or Paula gets a much higher paying job that you kind of have to send her to school. And just hearing from you that you appreciated the fact that you were outside of school. I mean, sorry, outside of your home to gain a different perspective and um to be able to do different things is making me feel better about the fact that I am going to have to send my daughter to school, which is something that I'm a little hesitant and
Fair.
anti-school.
Says the person who's a teacher at a school.
Well,
Fair.
isn't that the reason why they say you never watch how the sausage is made, because
Yep.
it will make you not want to eat
Yep.
it.
Yeah,
So
that's very
yeah.
fair.
And it's not necessarily that I'm completely anti-school, but I do think that one needs to be a lot more intentional and to implement certain values that I think is difficult to have in public and larger networks of schools such as Catholic schools or charter school networks, etc.
Yeah.
So that's the main crux of my hesitancy, is that the larger the networks of schools are, and the more children and the more bureaucratic, um, the more hierarchical and sort of stifling of individuality and creativity that they become. And so that's mostly what it's all about.
Yeah, and I had the privilege of, like, not having a learning disability, like, that, I think my mom would have ideally liked to have homeschooled us, both my sister, like, she didn't have the resources or necessarily the energy to, like, be able to homeschool her effectively and myself and my brother at the same time. And it was just like, you know what? We had pretty good special ed programs in our public school district we happened to. And it was just kind of, what worked. And it worked that she could homeschool me because I didn't need necessarily the, like, extra time or help. And I could function socially in a classroom, whereas not everyone could. My brother had some difficulty with that. And it's just like, I feel like it depends on your district. It depends on the kid,
Yeah.
it can depend on the year even. I feel like some years things work better than others. If you end up with something crazy like a COVID year, like that throws everything out the window, like, yeah, I feel like I can see the pros and cons for so many different systems. And like you said, once you're, like, in the system yourself, you start to notice the flaws and the things that really don't work, which is eye-opening and important things to notice, though sometimes discouraging.
Yeah, exactly. What are your views on politics? And yeah, can you delve into that?
Yeah. Um, so like I said, grew up very conservative Christian. I feel like my politics and, like, religion, as they often are kind of intertwined. Um, but I went to, like, it was considered a liberal Christian college in California, Azusa Pacific. Which in retrospect is actually still pretty darn conservative, but compared to what I grew up in, everyone was like having an aneurysm when they found out I was going there. Like, you can't go there. That's like the liberal college that some of their professors might be atheists and they don't believe in like a young earth and just all this stuff that I was like, okay. But I feel like as my religious deconstruction happened, my political deconstruction happened like kind of simultaneously, honestly. Um, and I'm definitely the liberal snowflake from the Pacific Northwest now, like very much so.
Yeah.
So yeah, definitely left. And just, I feel like as I was deconstructing so many things and was trying to, and just was exposed to more perspectives, that's kind of what did the deconstruction for me. It's like once I got out of my bubble and like met people who were of different sexualities, gender identities, socioeconomic statuses, race, ethnicity, cultures, like suddenly it was like, oh, okay, these issues that I thought were so easy to understand and pigeonholed are actually so complex. And like, duh, that's how the world is. I'm not sure why I thought everything's black and white.
Yeah.
But just as I realized like the complexities and how like certain communities of people were impacted by some legislation, that it was like, well, that's not my community, so like that doesn't matter to me, I'm going to vote on what affects me and my particular demographic. But just realizing like, no, that's not like really respecting humans or God's creation and people. And I think that's kind of what made me change my mind on a lot of things too. It's just like being exposed to different perspectives and demographics and communities of people.
Yeah, you had mentioned the enlargement of the concentric circles, and again, it's just sort of like an enlargement of the circles of sympathy and empathy, and um, I do think that it's very easy in our youth to have a Manichaean perspective where there is a black and white um, mindset, just because it simplifies everything, right? Like we
Oh
might
yeah,
not have
totally.
the capacity to process um, and the complexity of the world, and so for our own mental and emotional sake, we just simplify it into a narrative of good versus evil, black
Mhm.
versus white, us versus them. And as we get older, we mature, we develop. We understand that it's way more complicated, it's way more complex, and the reductivist sort of perspective of our youth is so silly. And but obviously it's a necessary sort of maybe not necessary for the preternaturally sophisticated and mature people, but how many of those are there? And so I do think that it's something that most of us have to grow out of and to deal
Yeah.
with. You obviously had spoken about just growing up Calvinist and Christian conservative. So do you want to talk a little bit more about that, and maybe how you've um, distanced yourself a little bit from that, or how you've incorporated those beliefs from your family and your youth into um, your views now? I would be interested in hearing that.
Yeah. So I think that deconstruction definitely did start at Azusa, where I went to college, because it was like the first time I had heard an understanding and a perspective of God, of Jesus being with the people on the margins and being with those and being in solidarity with people who are marginalized. That was just not, I just never heard, I think it's called liberation theology. I had just never heard like that perspective before. Of just like, oh, Jesus is with this Samaritan woman who's like, first of all, he's hanging out with a woman, not accepted. Also, somebody who's Samaritan, not accepted. Also, she's alone at like a well. Like, that seems, a little dicey at that time, for a man to be alone with a woman. And just kind of hearing stories like that, and like, oh, Jesus is like with the tax collectors and the woman who is like openly menstruating, and like children, and just people who are not valued or centered in society. And it was just kind of my first hearing of that, and was like, oh, this makes more sense to me. this tracks. Like, I can get behind that more. Like, that makes more sense. Um, and then after I graduated, I was with the Mercy Volunteer Corps in Guyana, South America for 2 years. And I had never been exposed to any type of Catholicism before. I just did not grow up around anyone who's Catholic. Also, I could totally be wrong on this, but I feel like I had just not really met or seen a lot of Catholics or like Catholic churches in the Pacific Northwest. I feel
Yeah.
like on the East Coast, it's like I see so many more like Catholic churches and hear about Mass so much more. I feel like there's more of a culture here. I could be so wrong because again, it could be those concentric circle bubbles. But I just like didn't really know much about it at all. And Mercy Volunteer Corps, they're like, well, to be a volunteer, you need to be like accepting and open of like all faiths, including Catholicism, but you don't actually have to be Catholic to be a volunteer. And I was like, okay, fair. Like, I'm down for that. And it was just funny that I was like suddenly serving with all these nuns. And I was just like, I had to like watch my friends who were other volunteers like do the sign of the cross because I was like, I don't know how to do that. Do you start up here? Do you start on the right? Or, like, I just had no idea and was just like, okay, try to adapt, try to assimilate quickly. Like, not only was I trying to adapt to a new country and culture, it was like also adapting to a new religious culture at the same time. Like, okay, how do you do this? And between that and then now I'm in grad school at St. Joe's, which is a Catholic university, and then teaching at a Catholic school. It's so funny because my family's like, what? Like, you're so
Are
really deeply immersed in Catholicism when you
you
never.
are you Catholic?
I know. I was like, I'm not, but I just am suddenly like really immersed in it weirdly. My grandma was like, wow, my parents who are Catholic would be so confused, but so proud that you're like somehow really in this. Um, but for me, I just was drawn to like the social justice, like components of Catholicism that I think are really cool. That specifically like Sisters of Mercy and a lot of Jesuits are like kind of on the front lines. Um, and with the Mercy Volunteer Corps, like their four like main values that really stick out to me, like they're kind of pillars that they call them. It's like simple living, social justice, like living in community with others, and spirituality. And it was just like those four, I like, even after coming back and living stateside, are still things I'm trying to constantly incorporate into my life and like sort of have as guiding points.
Mhm.
Um, but it was interesting then to be coming to our school and being thrown in as a long-term sub for religion and like and specifically getting them ready for confirmation. I was like, I don't even know what confirmation is. Like, oh gosh, I don't want to out myself as like someone who just does it. I don't know what I'm doing. And was just like quickly trying to research and figure out what to do and like what to be teaching. Um, and still being like very open to that, even if it's not necessarily like my belief system, but being very open to like, I love the caring for your community and being on the front lines of social justice issues, which I understand is not representative of all like Catholic, I don't know if sects is the correct word, but like groups and leanings. But from those I've spent time with and like really engaged with, I really respect that. I'm probably more like agnostic currently of just like having deconstructed and gone through all those, not really, I guess, growing pains, but also shrinking pains in a way of just like my worldview having to change so much in like 5 years, which I feel like is very angsty 20 something of me to say, but I feel like it's still accurate of just like, okay, you remove yourself from the bubble and suddenly what still stands and what doesn't.
Right.
But yeah, still being very like open to other religions, but not necessarily have found my like niche or feel a need to find a niche in it.
I'm in my late 30s and I'm in the same boat that you are in terms of
Fair.
Gnosticism, finding
Validating.
peace. I mean, I I grew up Catholic. My parents were Catholic. I, from a very early age, rebelled against that and was pretty much an atheist for a long time. And I want to say that maybe toward my late 20s, I started to um, discover and just research and question my own set of beliefs. And like you've been saying, deconstructing how I approached and related to the world and existence. And now in I feel that, like we've talked about, the complexity and the complications of existence and what this all means and purpose, have made it so that I'm very humble in knowing that it's a lifelong process and a lifelong journey to discover some semblance of certitude or certainty about any of this. And if not, that's okay too.
Yeah.
Um, but just being open, like you've been talking about, and constantly being curious and having that hunger for meaning and understanding, I think goes a long way in being able to approach these questions, um, well, right? Because I don't think that when I was younger and I was so adamant about uh, rejecting the teachings of my parents and sort of the what I deem to be the hegemonic ideas of religion in all societies. I don't think that that was a necessarily good perspective to take either, but it might have been a necessary step in my dialectical growth as a man and as a person. Um, but here I am, and I think that if we just take those four pillars that you mentioned, right, and apply it to our own lives, regardless of faith or whether you're a believer or not, I think it will go a long way to making your life so much more robust and fulfilling, right? Because spirituality doesn't necessarily entail religion. Um, Being in community doesn't necessarily entail being part of a church or a community of believers, but it does show you that there needs to be some sort of cohesion, and however you reach that will go a long way in making one's personhood as an individual so much more rich, right?
Yeah.
To do it with others. And I think finding that balance, that between all of those questions, is what life is all about.
Yeah. Yeah. And I
Um,
do appreciate that, like, when I do like catch up with friends from college, some have deconstructed, are agnostic or atheist, some have deconstructed and are still Christian. And it's just like I'm very grateful that I can count those people as part of my community, even if, like you said, it's not a traditional like church community necessarily. It's like, oh, this is just a community of like people supporting other people in their own journeys, and not, I've never like felt lesser than or judged from those friends, even those who have remained with their faith, which I'm like, if that is the right path for you, love that for you. Like, that's good. I'm glad, like, that it brings me joy knowing my friends have, and other community members or family members have those things that like have given them meaning and community and like guidance kind of. And it's just, I don't know, something I'm grateful for, that community can look so different to so many different people. And even people from different communities can blend together and create their own community.
And I'm so glad you brought up the fact that your friends aren't judgmental and that you also aren't judgmental, because we associate um, faith and religious beliefs so much with judgment
Right.
and dogmatic ideas of how one ought to behave, how one ought to believe, and just having a sense that, hey, we can all reach differences of how we believe, how we approach living, without it necessarily impacting how we treat others, right? And I think that's so much better way of relating and being with others, that it's sort of sad that that truth isn't shared by so many other people.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. There's still, I don't know, sometimes that people will ask, like, I went back and visited my parents' church. I went up to their Christmas Eve service last December for the first time since I left that church like 10 years ago. And just being so scared to be there. It's like, I need to take a shot before I go to this. Like, I don't know if I'm going to go. Like, I don't know. Because I was journalism. I studied journalism in college, and I had written some things for our like paper magazine just about like that deconstruction process, and I had somehow gotten back to some people from that community, and I had never put anyone on blast. It was just like my own reflections of myself and my own
Mhm.
deconstruction and like understanding, and it just like people were really not a fan of me kind of removing myself from that church community, and so it was kind of my first time going back since that time, and just being nervous and just being surprised by like, oh, many people were just very kind and welcoming and happy to see me, whereas I had kind of been anticipating or expecting this like intense judgment, which was probably just my own internalization. But yeah, I was
It's
like pleasantly surprised by it.
Yeah, and to be fair or transparent, whenever someone mentions Calvinism, all I think of is judgment, right?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
so I mean, I think yeah,
I've never
that's
heard of it, to be honest. I feel like a lot of people aren't familiar with it.
yeah. I mean, I don't know. Like, is it predestination? Is
Yes.
that the bit?
Yeah.
Yes. So I
Or
just
intellectual superiority, which there's still a lot of that.
So it's funny because you were teaching religion last year, and like for me, like Calvinism, Catholicism, and all these conversations around predestination and free will, original sin were, I don't know why, but probably because I'm super into philosophy, are just things that stuck with me from like social studies in high school.
Mm.
I'm like, Calvinism, John Calvin. That's a very interesting fella. Very, very smart, but also kind of judgmental and very
He's
much an elitist
yeah,
who is, I'm like, how are we only going to have this super small minority of people being saved?
yeah.
Um, so Calvinism, but also Jehovah's Witnesses also have a
Mhm.
similar idea of like only 44,000 people are going to be chosen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard of it because I was just super interested in those sort of religious theological questions growing up. And that word and the idea of judgment has always just lurked in the back of my head. Maybe because, like as a good cat, not a good cat, sorry, growing up Catholic, you're just like, I know I say I'm an atheist. I know I'm, fulminating against the silliness of believing in these things. But in the back of your head, you're like, I just want to be saved too. Like maybe I should reconsider my positions because I'm not trying to like burn in hell. Do you do anything for towards self improvement? Any sort of mental or physical consciousness practices?
Yeah, so I feel like with grad school and also working full time, and it's just been, I don't know, a lot. I feel like I've been slipping in a lot of those areas and trying to work my way back into that, because I feel like I used to be very good at being very mindful and like giving myself space and time for reflection. I feel like I just have been not doing a great job of that in the last year and a half. Um, but something I'm trying to get back into is when I was living in Guyana, did salsa dancing, started doing that as just like a self care practice, getting to meet other people like around my age, learning something new and fun that had wanted to learn for a while. So I've been trying to get back into that. There's actually a pretty big community in Philly of salsa, bachata, merengue, like classes and um, open like floor nights like every weekend. So I've been trying to get back into that a little bit more, just as a way of movement and like joy and movement, and not feeling like, I don't know, having like uh being annoyed of having to move. Like I feel like a lot of exercise can feel like for me, I'm just like, oh,
Yeah,
like I have to do this not because I want to. Whereas
right.
dance is just, I don't know, for me a lot more intentional and joyful, and it's just more fun. Um, with our grad program, we live in community with other teachers. So I live with 12 other people, that are all in education in some way. And we do weekly spirituality nights, as a group too, which is fun because sometimes we'll do meditation or a yoga practice, or just kind of sharing how things are going, for everybody. So I do appreciate those like kind of weekly check-ins, with other people in education too, of just being able to kind of see where everybody's at.
Yeah.
But yeah, not as much like self improvement as I would like. And I know I'm keeping one of those people that's like, oh, when this is done, when this season's
Yeah.
when, because I'm also doing the play right now, which is like I'm at school till 5 or 6 every day, and it's like when the play season's done and my master's is done. It's like I know some other excuse will just pop up, so I just need to get on it.
Or maybe not. I mean, like you said, life comes in seasons, so you never know what the next season will hold for you. It also sounds to me that a lot of your self improvement isn't necessarily based on physical improvement or even spiritual, but well, yeah, spiritual, but more towards like a grappling with your ideas and beliefs and deconstructing them. And so I think that's definitely a form of self-improvement, just grappling intellectually with the
Sure.
legacies of your family, the legacies of your religion, the legacies of who you thought yourself to be, and allowing for growth to emerge from that questioning of the foundations of your identity. So I think that's a form that is probably a lot more, a lot harder than just, waking up and going for a run,
Oh,
right?
thank you. Yeah,
um,
I was out to dinner with a couple of my roommates like 2 weeks ago, and just like a random weeknight. I don't know how our conversation got to like what we were like in high school or college or something. And I was like, you guys would not have liked high school or even really college, Marissa. Like, they're like, really? Like, what do you mean? I'm like, I just was so much of that like judgmentalism. And I feel like I've had to claw my way out of that so much. And like, I don't know. And they were surprised. And I was like, you're being surprised at that is like the biggest affirmation and like compliment I could receive of just, I don't know. I feel like that has been such a process and a journey.
yeah, there you go. So a definite example of self-improvement right there. Any big regrets in your life so far?
I think staying in places or with people for too long that I knew early on I didn't need to be spending time there. Whether it's like a job and knowing kind of right off the bat, like, oh, this is not going to be beneficial for me professionally, spiritually, um, like own personal growth wise, or in relationship with like people platonically, romantically, anywhere in between, of just knowing like this is not really serving towards my growth or health necessarily, and still like trying to convince myself like this is fine. When I think that's something I've been able to grow in a lot recently too, is just kind of knowing early on like, okay, this isn't going to be necessarily healthy or beneficial or positive, and getting better at being able to remove myself or move on from certain roles or people. But I think, yeah, I don't feel like I've been plagued with any massive regret. I'm very grateful for that. But I
Yeah.
think as far as just regret of that habit of not necessarily listening to my gut, um, when I know that it's time to move on from somewhere or something or someone.
And finally, to wrap up the what's lacking question, what is your favorite book, movie, and album of all time?
I was sitting with this for so long because I am such like, when it comes to each of those things, it's so I can be a very indecisive person, and it can be hard for me to really like narrow it down to like this one is the best or like this one's my favorite. But I think I have my list. And for a book, The Westing Game is my favorite. It's like a middle school level like mystery book. It's this author Ellen Raskin, who only wrote like 2 books, but this one won, I think, like Pulitzer maybe, and it's like one of her first books. But it's just kind of a fun mystery, like you don't know who like did the murder, and it's kind of a like a who done it, but the character development is really really interesting. I have a couple copies on my shelf at school because I'm trying to force my kids to read it for fun. I really like that one. Um,
Nothing sounds like fun when you're forced to do
you're
it.
going to read this book
Yeah,
whether you like it
and
or not. I
yeah,
don't like
you're
it.
going to have fun.
It's my favorite, so I'm forcing you to read it. Um, for movies, I literally just watched this last night and forced some of my roommates to watch it. I guess that seems to be my pattern at the moment. Um, is 10 Things I Hate About You, the rom-com from like the 90s, early 2000s. It's
Uh-huh.
set in Seattle, so I'm a little biased with that. But also just it really holds up still, of just like some of its commentary on like race and feminism and where some of those intersect too, and just the humor. I don't know, it really holds up. I still am a huge fan of it.
Yeah.
And like
I've seen it. I don't remember it.
that's fair.
Like
I told Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Heath Ledger and Julia Stiles when they're like in their 20s.
Yeah, Heath Ledger in that movie, I think that was like one of his first roles, if I'm not mistaken. And I was just like, oh wait, this is the guy from Batman. Like,
yeah, sure.
All right, leveling up. But maybe I should not think of leveling up from that, because you love it, and
it's great.
It's a great movie. So maybe I'll rewatch it and see if the commentary is as good as you say.
Good. And as far as albums, I really like Walk the Moon's album Talking is Hard. I think it's like 2014, maybe 2013. It just felt like kind of a soundtrack to like my college years. And I saw them twice randomly. I saw them in college in LA, and I saw them again in London like a couple months later. And I don't know, it was just like kind of one of those albums my friends and I all listened to, and it was always on. It's kind of, I like it for just like the memories associated with it. Like good band, good music, but also just feel like I choose the music I listen to based on like friends or memories. Just like it was always on our road trips. I went and saw them with a bunch of friends too. I listened to them a ton my like last couple of years of college too. So just
I've never heard of that band. So what genre is this?
Oh, they're like indie pop. You know the song "Shut Up and Dance with Me"? That's them.
It sounds. Oh yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah. It sounds familiar. I think if I. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I think indie pop is, or like alternative pop is like technically the genre.
What's their name again? Talking is Hard is the album, and what's
Walk the Moon
Walk the Moon. Okay. Thank you for being part of the podcast. This was an amazing, great conversation. I really appreciated picking your brain and getting to know your background. It was fascinating. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited for our springtime. Maybe we can continue our recess monitoring conversations once the sun comes back.
We most definitely will. Take care.
Good. All right. See you later.